Hey all, so we're back with another Spotlight with Context, and today we are talking about Dazzler. There's a lot of fun stuff in here. She goes boom, she has rhythm games. Let's get right into it. So, survivability of 3, she has anti-thorns mechanics. That's kind of the big thing going on here. There's not a whole lot else going on in survivability. You can definitely give her some credit for falter, like finding non-standard openings generally helps you take less chip damage. Between the two, like she has advantages in the fights where you're going to want to use her, but she doesn't have like regen or really strong armor or anything like that. So 3 is pretty fair. Damage of 5, this is kind of her main thing. She's a nuke. She is intentionally a nuke. She's a nuke tuned at battlegrounds. If there's not something specifically stopping her, she's probably just going to go special 1, special 2. Oh, look at that, they're gone. Ease of use 3, how quickly and efficiently you go special 1, special 2 is definitely going to depend on how comfortable you are using her dash to get openings for your heavies, how good you are at the special mini games. They're not very difficult. I would consider it significantly easier than perfect release, just to call that out. But you do have to learn them, right? And then just basically making sure that you can get to a good tempo threshold for your cash out. There's some skill required in that, but you can do pretty much all the same things a little more slowly and more easily. So, middle of the road. Utility of 3, she's not necessarily a utility powerhouse. There's not a lot of immunities, but she does have access to Pursuit to turn off Evade. She does counter Thorns. She does have Falter. She has the ability to create her own openings, like we talked about. And all of those things add together to give her what I kind of like to describe as get out of the way utility. Meaning that she's not necessarily opening up brand new matchups with her utility. It's more where you want to use her. She clears the path so that she can do what she's supposed to do. And so that utility is going to serve you well. It's very well targeted. And then Defender Strength of 2.5. It's pretty simple. She's like a bit of a tankier Morbius. I actually forgot to mention that during the survivability, is that she cuts down crit damage. That does help her out a little bit. But yeah, the tankier Morbius line that I was using is basically she does cut down on crit damage, she has that physical damage protection, and her dash is a bit threatening, but as with Morbius, you can bait it out and then just continue on your way, and there's not a whole lot going on here. She is a 2.5 instead of a 2 because her special attacks combined with the dash and the tankiness, it all adds up to being a little bit more annoying than a 2, which is generally like, oh, we don't worry about them unless there are ugly nodes on them. But I think she's definitely still below a 3. You'll get used to her pretty quick. So, strengths and weaknesses. We already talked about this. Damage. Boom. Dazzling Dash attacks. We've talked about this a little bit. That is where her falter comes from. She also has access to a stun here. It's a free opening, and it's specifically a free opening for a heavy once you get used to it, which is very nice. And then damage reflection, specifically for physical damage, but she's basically Namor plus for that physical damage. So there's plenty of things that this won't work on, but where it does work, you not only stop it, you also turn it back on them, and that's going to feel great. Weaknesses, like it says here, damage caps. Pretty much all of her damage is specifically in her special 2, and the red numbers attached to it are based on damage dealt, right? There's a decent number of hits in the special 2, but a lot of the damage is specifically in the final hit. If something is capping your damage or otherwise limiting that special, it's going to feel much, much worse. She's also pretty vulnerable to weakness in this way, because no matter how high her attack or her prowess or her reverb gets, if her attack rating, if her modified attack rating is cut in half, say, you're going to feel that. So be careful with things like inequity slowing you down, but she is still Dazzler and she does still have really good damage. And for the most part, caps are going to be the thing that you need to worry about the most. So, Cowardice also slows her down. This one is more explicit, right? She cannot get her really big special 2 if she's suffering from cowardice, kind of like how Kitty turns off if she has cowardice on her. And then next up, energy resistance. Most of her damage is energy, and she amplifies that with resonance. Now, she does have a guaranteed crit on the special 2, so she'll cut through a certain amount of resistance with that, right? As long as the opponent doesn't have some resistance to critical penetration. But the red numbers that she gets from resonance will still be hit by that energy resistance. And anything that is not a crit, or if you mess up the special 2 and the final hit isn't that crit, any of those will be a big problem, right? Because if she doesn't land a crit, then resonance gets hit twice, right? Because energy resistance will cut the damage the hit itself does, and then that will make the damage dealt part of resonance smaller, and then energy resistance will hit that again, right? So somebody like Guardian definitely slows her down, but I do want to still point out that critical hit interaction because it doesn't slow her down quite as much as it would somebody else. So getting into the abilities, right off the bat, Dazzler is immune to bad vibes and to Nullify. So first, Nullify Immune Mutant. As we saw with White Tiger, Nullify Immune in a class that doesn't have access to that yet finds places, right? This means that Dazzler is great on Power Snack, on Buffet. It's going to come up. This also makes her Special 2 significantly safer and is the main reason it's in here. The buffs in her Special 2 are only there during her Special 2, so you don't really have to worry about expiry. There's a bunch of things that can still mess with them, like Stagger or Fate Seal or a bad time, but you at least don't have to worry about, as you're cashing out, as you're throwing your Special 2, Buffet, Power Snack, Long Shot, right? None of those are going to mess with you as you're going for your cash out. If Dazzler's opponent isn't a tech champion, their critical damage rating is set to 0 and cannot be increased. This is kind of an updated implementation of how Man-Thing works, but specifically with that carve-out for tech champions. It's important to call out the reason there's a carve-out for tech champions there is that if this wasn't there, then somebody like Guardian or Prowler or Infamous Iron Man, if their critical damage rating was set to 0, then their critical replacement effects, like Guardian's Shocks or Prowler's Ruptures, would also be hit. And then she would be punching counterclass in a pretty bad way. So she doesn't do that, but against other classes, their crits don't really do anything, and that is very much by design. Look for other methods of dealing damage, right? She doesn't have any dot immunities, so that part is still quite good. Although I would be careful specifically with Rupture or any other physical damage dots, as we'll get to in the SIG. If Dazzler's opponent has the Stand Your Ground Mastery active, it is removed. This is something I want to spend a little bit of time on here. I'll probably talk about it more later as well. But there's a lot of talk in this community about turning off masteries, right? Being blunt, that talk often looks something like, Kabam, how dare you interfere with masteries? Also, now that you have, nothing matters, so you should turn off everyone that inconveniences me all the time. That is not how we're approaching this. I've said before, I think that masteries are like the rest of the game, right? They are not sacred, they are a valid design tool to interact with. That said, masteries are something that we try and be very careful with. And even if you don't always agree that we're being careful, understand that we're coming at this talking about it a lot in our design meetings, right? Like, using the obvious one, Photon turns off willpower because not turning it off would be worse, right? Serpent turns off dexterity because the alternative would have been to just make his specials undexable, right? We had that option. We didn't go that way because we wanted to make it specifically dependent on a buff that you could then deal with. difficult to do, but that interaction was on purpose, right? It's fine if you don't like the design decision, but we are not doing this randomly. Similarly, with Dazzler, for most of her development, she did not have this clause, right? We really tried to make her work without hitting stand your ground. And the reason it's in here is because she didn't. This was not just thrown in to make things more convenient. This was thrown in because the play style that she has, the animations she has, she was running into it too often, and it just had to go. So that's why this is here, but I just want to talk about that because I know Mastery is a very hot button topic. I'm sure I'll get some comments on that at the end of this. But moving on. While dodging back, Dazzler cannot be struck by attacks. She does not benefit from the Dexterity Mastery, but builds 1 tempo when dodging a special attack hit. So this is obviously very powerful. It means that she gets around people who disable Dexterity specifically. Very strong. There are certain obstacles that she has against some of the people who turn off Dexterity anyway, so that's not necessarily a free ride, but yeah, very powerful ability. The most on-target use of this ability is specifically Dazzler versus Bullseye. This means that if you dex his special attacks, you don't get those bleeds from dexing because you, quote, weren't using dex. So very, very helpful in that matchup, and obviously some other good uses as well. So tempo, this is your core resource. You can build it up to 100. Dazzler builds tempo as excitement mounts, right? Light and medium attacks build 1 tempo, so that's just your bog standard. You don't do anything else. Tempo's ticking up as you fight. Or 5 if the attack strikes the opponent while they're standing up. So this is specifically referring to what we sometimes call a wake-up intercept. And so that means if you knock the opponent down, probably with a heavy, but maybe with a special if you time it properly, and then hit them as they are standing up, usually with a medium, right? You knock them down with a heavy, you dodge in at the perfect moment, you hit them with that medium. That's what this is talking about. Then you get 5 instead of 1. So those little bonuses of 4 are one way to speed up your tempo gain and improve your payout. Heavy attacking a non-stunned opponent also builds 5 tempo. Dazzler's personal stun passive does not count against this, right? So if you parry the opponent and then heavy them, you're not getting tempo. If you use Dazzler's stun, which we'll get to very shortly, and then heavy them, you're fine. But that's an important distinction there because any stuns that you get from like incursions hacks or nodes or the parry mastery are going to lock you out of this, but Dazzler's own stun is fine. As a defender, each hit in the attacker's combo meter also builds 1 tempo. So most champions are just going to build tempo naturally. Some skill champions are going to build tempo a lot faster. If you're fighting her, again, I don't think she's that dangerous on defense, but be a little bit careful using someone with multi-hit basics, right? Next up, Dazzling Dash attacks. Building 10 tempo sets the stage for a dash attack. Only 1 attack may be readied at a time. So there's a counter on her HUD that starts at 10 and counts down. Once it gets to 0, you can use a dash attack, right? It stops counting down once it's at 0, but then once you use the dash attack, it goes back to 10, you start counting down again, right? That's the only one may be readied at a time. Once this is readied, dashing forward from outside striking distance or during the opponent's special attack inflicts a falter passive for 1.2 seconds, paused until the end of the dash. So this is, again, fairly similar to how Kitty Pryde works. She dashes forward, and you inflict a falter instead of yourself phasing. Different theming, right? Because Kitty can literally phase. Dazzler is just blinding the opponent with how shiny and awesome she is. Same effect. You're getting an opening, and it is based on miss. But you have to specifically dash, right? And the from outside striking distance is trying to let you know that not all medium ones are dash attacks. You specifically have to be far enough away that your character enters the dash animation, which then automatically transitions into the medium one animation. This sounds so Byzantine. The point is, don't just parry and then medium and expect this to work. You need some distance most of the time. But because special dexes kind of put some constraints on how far away you can be, Dazzler does have that same extra clause that Morbius does, and basically any medium that punishes a special attack automatically does this, right? So you don't have to be as precise with your spacing if the opponent is throwing their special attack and you are dashing in to punish them, right? That part automatically gets it. Any other time, you have to be a little more careful. This falter is also paused until the end of the dash. Dashes are usually pretty short, so that doesn't have a huge impact on it, but worth calling out because it will be a little bit longer than 1.2 seconds. If this attack is blocked, it inflicts a stun passive for 1.5 seconds. That's enough time to throw a heavy, and so you can get your 5 tempo. As an attacker, on hit or on block, it also deals a burst of energy damage per tempo. So you keep your tempo high, you do your Dazzling Dashes as much as possible, your damage goes up still further, right? Still energy damage, like we said earlier, most of hers is, but you can throw some more red numbers in there on the way to your special 2. Another thing to call out is that the stun passive is not the only way that this dash gives you openings for a heavy. That's the easiest way. It's the safest way. And so if you want the stun, you probably want to make sure that your opponent is blocking before you head in. But one thing to practice with this kit is specifically going for the dash, inflicting the falter, allowing the opponent to miss, and immediately going for a heavy, right? It's somewhat similar to how when Viv phases with a well-timed block, you can then immediately go for that heavy and it will hit the opponent. Same thing here. And so you can use your dash attacks to falter and heavy the opponent, gain 5 tempo back, and then if your opponent doesn't have a bar of power, then after you knock them down with your heavy, you can then immediately charge in, do a wake-up intercept, catch them with a medium, and gain another 5, and you are potentially at 10 tempo from only 2 hits there. Then you can dash back and do this again. So that is kind of the upper ceiling on how quickly she can build tempo per hit. That's not normally worth doing because you may not be building enough tempo, you may not be building enough power to actually throw special attacks. But I do want to call that out because if other things about tempo start to get tight, that is technically possible, and it's something that's probably worth learning how to do if you want to use Dazzler to her fullest. The dev notes also call out here, and it is worth noting, when Dazzler is at max tempo, this counter stops ticking down, and so you can't use any dash attacks at 100 tempo until you use the special 2 and cash it out. Alright, special 1, this is your ramp special. Tapping block in rhythm with the 4 blasts, builds 10 tempo each. This is a very evenly spaced special. It's literally just boom, 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 boom. She's a music character, right? That is on purpose. It's pretty easy to learn, and that's your way to get tempo. Even if you miss one of these, you can still get the others, so being even okay at this is still going to ramp you. And then the final hit inflicts a non-stacking energy vulnerability passive for 30 seconds. So 30 seconds is a pretty good chunk of time. Part of that is because Dazzler's playstyle sometimes builds power more slowly. We kind of already talked about that, right? As you're playing with dashes, you're probably doing fewer just plain 5-hit combos. That 30 seconds is going to help you make sure you cover the whole special 2 when you get there. And then the special 2 is your cash out, your showstopper. And if Dazzler is not suffering from cowardice, then she gains 10% resonance, fury, 10% prowess buffs until the end of the attack, but these potencies increase by 1% flat per tempo. So that fury there is 10% of her overall base attack, to call that out. And so that means that when you're at max tempo, each of these becomes 110%. So you gain 110% of your base attack. your special multiplier goes up by 110% non-flat, and then you also gain 110% resonance. So let's follow through the math there for a minute. Actually, to make the math simpler, let's assume 90 tempo. That's a pretty reasonable cash out. You're somewhat rarely going to be all the way up at 100. But yeah, so let's just do the math at 90 tempo, because that means that all of these buffs are 100%, right? First up, you look at the 100% Fury. That means your damage doubles. Then you look at the 100% Prowess. That means your damage doubles again. So now you are doing 4 times as much damage as you would without these buffs, and then you gain a 100% resonance, meaning that if the opponent has no energy resistance, which most opponents don't, your damage is going to double again. And so relative to not having these buffs, the base damage of the Special 2, when you have 90 tempo, the Special 2 does 8 times that damage, which is also increased by the energy vulnerability, right? Because off the top of my head, I think that energy vulnerability, 1500, is roughly 30%, which means that because the Special 2 itself is energy damage, that 4 times damage we talked about gets boosted by 30%. So now you're looking at 520% damage. I think I did that correctly. And then the resonance tries to deal another 520% damage, but that also gets multiplied by 30%. This one I am going to use a calculator for, I don't care. And so that does another 676% damage. And so that's a total of almost 12 times the damage the attack would have done with no buffs and no energy vulnerability. That's a lot of damage, like the strength section said earlier. So just making sure that we are fully processing all of that. And that's before we get to this third buff. Sorry, skipping over the second buff, if you have the personal energy vulnerability up, this is also unblockable. Your HUD's prettier, you can throw it into block. Yay. But this third bullet, if you tap block in rhythm with the first 5 lasers, you get precision buffs. But if she reaches at least 4 of these precisions, the final laser is a guaranteed critical hit, right? Which means that on top of all of that math we just did about the Special 2 being multiplied by a factor of 12, it's also a guaranteed critical hit, and so now you are bringing in critical damage. Now, you can do this with or without tempo, with or without the energy vulnerability, so I still think it's probably more worth considering all of the above as just increasing the damage by a factor of 12 or more. But yeah, that is what is at play here. The rhythm game for the Special 2 is a little bit more difficult than the Special 1, but also notice that you only have to get 4 of those precisions out of 5 chances, so we're throwing you a bone anyway. And then at the end of the special attack, reset Dazzler's tempo. So you do a whole bunch of damage, you start over, pretty standard cash out, kind of Shang-Chi-ish there. We already touched on this, but the dev notes called out, so I'm going to say it again. All of these buffs are immune to nullify, and Dazzler removes them at the end of the attack. They do not expire with the duration, so you don't have to worry about them feeding Mystic Dispersion. They can still be staggered, they can still be prevented by Fate Seal, they can still be prevented by Neutralize. It is worth keeping those things in mind. She is not fully protected against buff control, but she's safe against Nullify. Now, Special 3, Dazzler kicks things into high tempo for 40 seconds, allowing her to build up to 150 tempo and doubling all tempo gains. Now, I'm not going to go do all of the math again, but everything we just said about how much damage she gets at 90 tempo, now each of those steps is multiplying by 2.6 instead of by 2, right? Because you're getting plus 160% damage at each of the steps. That's big. It's very big. You're coming closer, off the top of my head, to like a factor of 20 as opposed to 12. Additionally, I want to talk about this real quick. If this 40-second high tempo thing expires, you don't lose the extra tempo you've gained. You just can't go further if you're already above 100, right? So if you have managed to make it up to 130 after throwing the special 3 and then high tempo expires, you stay at 130 until you throw the special 2. You just can't keep going to 150. That said, you're probably going to get to 150 because you double all tempo gains while you're there. But calling that out because it can come up. And then a perfect result in the special 3 minigame increases this to 60 seconds or 50 if the result was semi-perfect. So if you're not familiar with those terms, if you're using a 5-star and up, a perfect result is when you get the green response from the special 3 minigame, and semi-perfect is when it turns yellow. So you can make that last longer, just take some timing. Kind of a theme for this character. And then on to the signature ability, Sounds of Light and Fury. During her hits, Dazzler takes no physical damage and instead reflects 200% of it back at the opponent as a burst of energy damage. So like we said, this is very similar to Namor, except stronger but more narrow. It is specifically for physical damage. This is aimed at things like Atuma's Thorns. It also works on incoming rupture damage. It does apply to physical hits, right? If Dazzler tries to intercept the opponent, fails, and gets hit, similar to Namor, you will capture that damage and reflect it back if that hit is physical. Things get a little messy around there, but I just figure some of y'all who have played Namor are curious if it's the same, and it is. And then second bullet, performing a Dazzling Dash grants a pursuit passive for 10 seconds, paused until the end of the dash. Again, the pause is not going to be that long, but if you are playing Dazzler well, you're definitely performing a Dazzling Dash every 10 seconds or so. And so this gets pretty close to the opponent can't evade after the first little bit of setup. And then synergy bonuses. For all of these, if your question is that a reference to a song or an artist, the answer is yes. So for Kitty Pryde, your favorite mutant's favorite mutant, Dazzler gains Incinerate immunity thanks to the silliest justification for an immunity we have ever printed on someone. Whatever, if it worked once, it'll work twice. And then Kitty Pryde, the first hit of her special 1, inflicts an Incinerate vulnerability passive for 10 seconds. So she gets kind of an alternate damage cash out. She gets more damage out of her Incinerate. She's not just special 2 focused. Forget-Me-Nots with Longshot. Dazzler gets an additional tempo when dodging a special attack hit. And then Longshot's side of the synergy while the opponent is Fate Sealed, meaning while they have that Incinerate debuff from the special 2 up, his basic attacks have a 10% chance to grant them an ignition buff for 1 second. Of course, that ignition buff will be instantly prevented by the Fate Seal and converted into an Incinerate passive because that's how Longshot works, so this is free damage. Additionally, this ability was coded with a 10% chance, and if you're familiar with how Longshot works, his base ability accuracy is 300%, so this is effectively a 30% chance. You're going to average 1 to 2 of these per 5-hit combo, so this is a pretty reliable way to get some extra damage out of your Longshot fights. Disco Inferno with Human Torch, Massacre, Omega Sentinel, Phoenix, and Sunspot. For Dazzler, performing a Dazzling Dash inflicts an Incinerate debuff. Doesn't deal a lot of damage, lasts for 10 seconds as long as the pursuit. This lets you take Polka Dot Power, gives Dazzler access to an Incinerate debuff. And then for your other synergy champions, Incinerate and Plasma debuffs last longer. Generally good for all of these, especially for Massacre and Omega Sentinel because they can then refresh those debuffs, and Sunspot has longer to convert them back into charges. Staying Alive with Black Widow Clairvoyant, Immortal Hulk, and Kindred. For Dazzler, once per quest when receiving damage that would knock her out, she instead gains an immortality buff for 6 seconds. Same things apply here as to her special 2. This buff cannot be nullified because she's immune to nullify, but there are other ways to mess with it. And then for the other synergy champions, dodging back after landing exactly 4 consecutive basic attacks grants a non-stacking vitality buff for 10.4 seconds. As a reminder, vitality is going to increase the strength of the regen effects, not their regen rate. There are some differences in how that applies. It's particularly important for Immortal Hulk because his regen rate can't be modified, but this works for his regen when he's doing his whole thing. It works for Kindred's regens in Nightmare Outbreak, and it works for the lifesteal on Clairvoyant's Special 2 when she is in Bleed Curse, so very helpful effect for all of them. Murder on the Dance Floor with Spiral. Both Spiral and Dazzler get a Jiggy With It buff for 10 seconds when knocking the opponent down. As a reminder, this is the one that makes you unstoppable while dashing, so somewhat helpful to both of their playstyles. Welcome to Die with Colossus, Cyclops Blue Team, Nightcrawler, Storm, and Wolverine. This is basically just one of those old mutant synergies where you have 10% special damage, but it's 20% if Magneto's on the team. This will improve Nightcrawler's bleeds. It kind of gets lost in Storm's prowess specifically. It's okay for Wolverine. It's particularly nice for Colossus because he has sources of attack, but he doesn't have sources of special damage in his kit, and so this is pretty big for him, especially if he crits. And then Take a Chance on Me is just a rebranded old school synergy that gives critical rating for everybody on the team with Domino, Hyperion, and Scarlet Witch. And there is a note in the spotlight, so I'll call it out here. Don't use the usual stat focuses for her. Special damage is going to get lost in her giant prowess. Crit damage, probably not going to be impactful enough. You can go for it, but I generally think crit damage is undertuned. Crit rate is going to be close to useless, and so the Spotlight recommends block proficiency to just make her a little bit tankier when things aren't going exactly your way, or maybe when you want to bait out a heavy to counter if your dash isn't ready, and I would generally second that recommendation. But that's Dazzler. She is, pun acknowledged and intended, dazzling. She's very flashy. She's good at just closing out fights in a big finish. She is a nuke. She is a nuke built for battlegrounds. She's very fun to play. She takes some time to master, but she is definitely worth it. And she's a blast. She's really fun to play. I've enjoyed using her. I'm definitely looking forward to picking her up from the Battle Pass. Haha, shameless plug. But seriously, I am. It's a steal for a character like this. I hope y'all enjoy her as well. And until next time, thanks so much for watching, and take care.